Hello, and welcome to Learning from Nature, the Biomimicry podcast with me, your host, Lily Ehrman. Thanks for tuning in today, wherever you are. Here in the Front Range of the Rocky Mountains, the trees have leaves again, flowers are popping up, and the birds are becoming more active. It's truly a beautiful transition. In this episode, we will be exploring how does nature communicate and make decisions. I have the pleasure of talking with Mr. Ebenezar Wikina about his biomimicry work at the intersection of wild dog communication and their democratic voting system of sneezes and policymaking in our own government. Ebenezar has over 13 years of experience working with more than 30 organizations across multiple sectors. He is the founder of Policy Shapers, a civic tech startup that empowers young people with the knowledge, skills, and tools they need to engage with public policy. He also works as campaign strategist at change.org, helping citizens build social movements reaching over 3 million users in Nigeria. Mr. Wikina is a World Economic Forum expert, senior category judge of the Queen's Commonwealth Essay Competition, the world's oldest international writing competition for schools, and international judge of the Association for International Broadcasting Awards based in London. Ebenezar is also a trustee of the Sickle Cell Awareness and Health Foundation, a pioneer member of the British Council's UK Africa Youth Advisory Board, and a founding member of the Open Government Youth Collective. He's currently leading the #ReformIELTS campaign, which seeks to end the corrupt practice of mandating Anglo-Africans to write English proficiency tests while seeking study or work opportunities abroad. This neo-colonial practice currently costs the African continent more than $10 million annually. So far, the campaign has mobilized over 80,000 supporters and influenced policy change in 21 universities around the world. Ebenezar is a Mandela Washington Fellow, Civic Hive Fellow, Bridge Fellow, and GIJN Fellow. He's also the winner of the first ever Sound City Africa MVP Award for Community Development, the Royal African Youth Leadership Award, and the NESG Exceptional Leadership Award, to mention a few. Mr. Wikina is an alumnus of the International Institute of Journalism, Abuja, the London School of Journalism, Harvard Kennedy School, and the Stanford Center for Professional Development. As you can probably tell from his amazing background, this is a really wonderful conversation and will get you thinking about policy and democracy in a new way. It's also a testament to how broad biomimicry applications can be. Learning from nature can be integrated anywhere across sectors to help us create a better future. Let's hop on in. I'm super excited to talk to you today. Can you please introduce yourself?
Thank you. Thanks a lot for having me. My name is Ebenezar Wikina. I'm a Nigerian public policy specialist, but my career, just as you read, spans across media, youth development, and quite a lot of work within the social movement space. I think I won't say stumbled on biomimicry, but I think I got to learn about biomimicry in 2011. There's a BBC. So back in the day, I used to be a huge BBC radio fan. So I listened to shows on the BBC. There was this episode of The Forum, is a show on the BBC where they talked about biomimicry. And it was so cool, just hearing about, ideas from shark skin and, the kingfisher, just hearing all of those things just sounded really cool. I was like, oh, this sounds very, very different, right? And I've always been fascinated by the natural world. So I think just jumping on Google that day, just finding out all the examples out there, I just thought, I really love to do this, in the future. So this was far back 2011. And I only got a chance to do a biomimicry program. I mean, I did quite a number of online programs, right? Free online courses just to learn more about it. But I think in 2021, I got a chance to do a practitioner's program, a formal program with Learn Biomimicry. Claire Janish, sadly, who's late now, she convinced me over and over, to get on the program. She's one of the evangelists, right? Always trying to get people to get on. And, I was lucky to get a huge funding support from the institution, and just getting on the program, learning a bit more about biomimicry beyond just the surface, imitates the idea, just learning about the entire process just got me really, really inspired. And that's actually where this project on trying to mimic the African wild dogs came about. But yeah, I've been really interested in biomimicry, especially applying biomimicry to like governance and communication and all of the things where, the kind of work that I do as a media person, someone who works in media and communications, how do we apply it to that? Apply it to like social structures. So during like Black Lives Matter, I try to write something around how we could imitate Argentine ants, seeing how they're able to do a lot of despite like even when they have different ant colonies, right? For the Argentine ants, even if there's a colony in Brazil and another colony in Nigeria, you bring all of them together in one space, they're able to identify that this is still an Argentine ant, even though it's from a different country. So I was just thinking of ways we could apply that to our own like civil relations and stuff like that. So that's a quick summary about me and
Awesome.
my experience with biomimicry. Yeah.
And I think it's super exciting too, because a lot of us, who are in the field and folks who are just joining the field oftentimes gravitate towards the area of biomimicry that's very form focused or process focused. And I think that's useful and empowering and gets people excited. But this space that you're in of understanding systems and communication and maybe a little bit more nuanced applications is super exciting. So if you wouldn't mind, can you explain a little bit more? Like, what was your project for that Learn Biomimicry practitioner program?
Yeah, sure. So the project has a name. we gave it a fancy name. It's called the 10-3 or 10:3 voting system. So I was just looking generally, right, at ways we could apply biomimicry to decision making, just searching through ask nature, trying to understand what are the various ways, nature, how does nature make decisions, how do ant colonies make decisions? And we kept searching various, organisms, trying to understand. And just around that time, the UN was having the climate change conference. It's called the COP conference. And, usually like during COP events, there's so much anticipation, people are excited to go. But, like consistently, always at the end of the conference, people often look like depressed, it's almost like the superpowers are not able to come to an agreement. So there's so much like disappointment and everything. So I just kept thinking, what are the ways we could help, make decision-making better in that particular space? Sadly, while that thought process was going on, Russia then invaded Ukraine, and the Security Council was then going back and forth on how to vote and veto power and everything. And I just thought that, that looked really that looked like an interesting scenario to base the idea. So I then started to think of, okay, so how does the Security Council make decisions, and how would another organism in nature make decisions that will be better than what we currently do, and how can we apply that? So how do we juxtapose that, side by side? So I then started to, I of course, through research, stumbled on the African wild dogs, and it just seemed like the perfect match, right? Because we have so many parallels, especially the Security Council itself has so many parallels with the African wild dogs. First, the council is made up of 15 countries, this UN Security Council. So it's a mix of like dominant and permanent and less and temporary countries. So the countries who come onto the council for 2-year tenures, they are voted in, and then they're made to leave. The 5 permanent countries, of course, are the superpowers: Russia, China, US, etc., France, and co. And then look at the wild dogs. The wild dogs also have a mix of dominant and less dominant dogs. So you have a pack of about 154 dogs, and they're dominant directed. But when it comes to decisions around, should we move to eat? Should we stay? Should we rest? When the pack has to make a collective decision, they don't just allow the dominant dogs to direct them anymore. So it then becomes an issue of, having a consensus style of voting that then makes them move forward. Whereas the Security Council, despite having 10 temporary nations and five permanent nations, you have a scenario where decisions are made only by the permanent. So like permanent nation, the permanent countries, which are of course the top 5, still can veto on a decision. And even if the council has reached the 9 votes, which is what is needed to arrive at a resolution, if a permanent nation says no, they just use their veto power and say no, everything just comes crumbling down, right? So I thought, oh, okay, so this looks interesting, right? And the dogs don't speak, they sneeze, right? That's why also are able to like use very complicated speech patterns and use words. They just have a sneeze voting system, and it seems to work really well because they've been using this for so many years, right? So I looked at it and I just thought, okay, so this is the perfect way to do. So I studied it a bit more. There's quite a bit of study out there. Ask Nature as well has a lot of resources on African wild dogs. And, I just found that so in an African wild dog park, so if a dominant dog, so think of it like a permanent Security Council member, wants the pack to move. So usually what African wild dogs do is after every feeding session, they rest for long periods. And then after the rest, they then have like what is called like a high-powered social rally. So they're just like moving around, just interacting with each other, deciding on what to do next. So if a dominant dog says he wants the pack to move to go eat or to go hunt, if the dog initiates a sneeze, and there's a minimum of 3 other sneezes from any other dog, could be a dominant dog, could be a less dominant dog. If they can get 3 other sneezes, the pack decides to move, right? If a less dominant dog initiates a sneeze during the high-powered social rally, and that less dominant dog can get 10 sneezes in addition to its own sneeze, the pack will decide to move, whether or not dominant dogs in that pack wants to move or not. As far as that 10 is able to be gotten, then it begins to move. So I thought like, oh, this is really interesting.
Yeah.
So it's a quorum system, it's a democracy, but it still doesn't negate the social influence of the dominant dogs, because then they need less number of votes to move. But at the same time, it still gives like agency and a voice sort of to like less dominant dogs, because even when they initiate something, they can make it work whether or not they have the support of the dominant dogs. So I thought, wow, this is this is a discovery. So of course we went into through class there, so we had so many sessions to review the idea, and we put it together after so many weeks of just reading and trying to study it more. That's how we got the 10-3 voting system. Yeah.
So I'm envisioning for UNs now we're going to do a sneeze vote. I'm just picturing this big majestic hall with all these world leaders. So how would this what does this look like when it's applied to our own political voting systems?
Yes. So I mean, the idea is that you can have, so we're currently testing. I mean, when I say we, so I'm a founder of Policy Shapers. Policy Shapers is a civic tech organization that's trying to get young people engaged in public policy, trying to get them to understand how policy works, and inspire them to want to influence policy through like campaigns and like advocacy movements. So we're trying to test this to see if it's possible to even try it for like different kinds of groups, right? So like an association or just different groups. But in the UN Security Council context, to implement this in that context, first you'd have to abolish veto power, because what's currently happens is that you have permanent nations. So the top 5 countries having veto power. Veto power means when everyone is trying to agree on something, there's some consensus. One of the top 5 countries can just say, no, I don't agree with this, and they use their veto power to cancel the votes. So if you still have that veto power, you continue to, ruin things, right? So we said, can't abolish veto power first. The second step is that currently, like the minimum number of votes required for a resolution is 9 on the Security Council of 15 members. We're saying instead of just having one minimum number of votes, share it into 2 like the wild dogs do, right? So for the permanent countries, if they can get a minimum of 7 votes, so if a permanent member raises a resolution, person can get up to 7 votes, the resolution passes. If a temporary member raises a resolution and they can get a minimum of 12 votes, resolution passes. Now, why 7 and 12? There are 5 permanent countries and 10 temporary countries. If you say you want to do 5 and 10, you would split the council into 2. And at some point, you'd have like, a lot of power versus less power. And then, it becomes very, very toxic, right? But if you make it 7 and 12, it means that for the term, even if, let's assume a situation where temporary nations are trying to gang up against the permanent nations, they still need 2 votes from the permanent nations to be able to pass a resolution. And even when permanent nations want to gang up, in quotes, against the temporary nations, they still need 2 votes from the temporary nations. So you leave space for like diplomacy and human interaction and stuff like that, just as the African wild dogs usually do. So yeah, I mean, that's it. And there's one interesting principle too. When the African wild dogs try, so not they don't arrive at a quorum at every social rally. So they try, and if maybe a dominant dog initiates a sneeze and doesn't get 2 other sneezes, they go back to rest and then come back again and try. So they conduct multiple like sneeze voting sessions. And so just like understanding diplomacy as well, one of the suggestions was to conduct multiple sessions as well to arrive at quorum. The percentage is 26% of first rallies ended in a decision, or 64% of 5th and 6th rallies often arrived at decision. So it means that the more rallies you have, the more like the decision shifts and people get a better understanding of what they want to do. So that's how you apply it to the UN Security Council setting.
So for your organization, are you like testing this out with groups? I'm curious what that looks like, because I think in the biomimicry space, there's kind of a big jump between I'm inspired by something in the biological realm and I want to apply it. What does that testing phase look like?
Yeah, I mean, so the first thing we did actually was to write to the United Nations Security. So the Security Council has a practice and research branch, and they often like request for like papers and studies, just stuff to help make their practices better, right? So we wrote to them and shared, our biomimicry idea with them. I'm sure it must have seemed very abstract at the start, but I think like they've been able to look through. And they promised to give like a feedback. We're still looking forward to that feedback. We've been able to also present the idea at a couple of sessions where people discuss like UN reforms and UN 2.0 and stuff like that. So that's from a more UN lens, but from a general voting lens, right? We currently are in touch with an association of professionals in Nigeria. So the association pretty much has like voting sessions for its president and for who leads them for the next 1 year and stuff like that.
Okay.
And we're trying to look at a group so the association currently it's a homogeneous association, right? So every voting member has like the same equal rights, right? But we're trying to look at a situation where, because this idea would work well in a group that is not really balanced. And truly, like if you look at things, nature, the world, things are often not really balanced all of the time, right? There's often like someone with a higher, social status, someone with a higher, something. There's always something making someone higher, right? And how do you then use this to make it a level playing field, sort of? So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to help the association sort of like maybe not introduce a hierarchy system, but try to vote in a different way, right? And see if it's possible for us to implement this particular style of voting in their forthcoming elections, which is sometime in July. And, so like people who have been previously leaders, might then be classified under the dominant people, and those who are like regular members, can then be regular, and then we see ways where we introduce that into the elections, just as a test, nothing concrete. They don't necessarily have to follow that voting style, but we think we'll have to test this over and over and over in several groups, in several places, for several kinds of votings and decision making before we can arrive at an idea, whether it's going to work even, for a human setting.
Yeah, I'm sure it'll take a lot of testing.
Yeah. So that's where we are so far.
You said something that sparked my interest too, because I think it is, this translation piece is about like acknowledging that there are uneven power dynamics everywhere in our human world. and understanding that nature has some strategies for that. I like this idea of like, you can have dominant members of a group, vote and move forward with something, and they need fewer of them, but you can also have more of the non-dominant vote and also kind of override the dominance. So there's like the dominance does come into play, but it's not reliant, and it gives others power and empowers them in a different way. The non-dominant folks. So I'm really excited by this. I feel like there's a lot of potential, and I'm sure you would agree.
Yeah. We're still testing it out, and I hope it will be useful because, like, we just had our elections in Nigeria. We just finished our presidential elections and our state elections, and there's so much. I mean, voting and democracy as a whole seems like there's a lot of, especially for developing countries, there's a lot of arguments on like, oh, this particular tribe is leading more, or this particular party seems to be leading more. There's always that kind of power imbalance. So just thinking of ways where we could apply this to maybe not level the playing field totally, but like make it more, give people more agency such that their thoughts, their ideas, whatever it is that they're bringing forward to the collective group, gets more say, as opposed to a situation where we just know that, okay, it's always the top guys who always make decisions and everyone just feels like they have to chicken out all of the time.
Yeah. And even here in the US, like our voting systems are so deeply flawed. And this could be like applied in different areas, different levels of that voting system. I'm thinking even just like city council, where we have cities trying to agree on policies and regulations and new development. And it's like, it takes forever to get any decisions made. So I also would like to mention, in the biomimicry space, we have kind of very literal applications, the form of a humpback whale fin, and it's going to be applied to a wind turbine blade. I also like this space of like, we are inspired by something in nature and the way that something in nature works, and we're applying it in a somewhat abstract way, right? So like, we know that it works like this, and this is how it could be translated. And that translated piece is like, we are getting away from the biology, but it's still functioning and still working like the biology, but in the challenge that we care about.
Yes, exactly.
And I think you spoke to this, but I'd like to just expand on it maybe a little bit more of like, we know that there's challenges in our current way of doing things for political systems. What are like one or two challenges for the way that we currently vote in political systems that this could solve?
I mean, I just think like the major challenge is that democracy is about the majority, but most times when you have a situation where the minority is not growing as fast enough to catch up with the majority, so growing in the sense that they don't have as much influence, society hasn't accepted them as enough, So how do you ensure that people who are often considered as minorities, either it's based on their tribe or their orientation, how do you ensure that they have a voice, in a way where the things that they bring forward to the table, are not just discarded as, oh, just one of those groups, or, one of those youth groups, or when young people or when women, women have thoughts. I mean, one of the things in Nigeria is that we've never had a female president. We actually have never had a female governor yet. I mean, we're hoping that we might have one this current elections, but the results are not showing that yet. So how do you ensure that even minority groups, when they're coming forward for elections, and maybe even just coming forward for decision making generally? So like in Nigeria, we have a situation where our budget is presented to the National Assembly, say like Congress in the US, and it's supposed to have like different thoughts and ideas, opinions. People are supposed to like poke holes in it and make sure that the final budget is representative of what everybody wants, and that's how we should spend the federation's money. But it usually never happens. It's often like the majority groups, and the majority, voices that's overshadow the minority voices. So how do we ensure that we have more minority representation in decision making? I think that's that's a broader way to look at it, beyond just our voting through the ballot, but how do we implement this to every level of decision making across governance, across organizations, and stuff like that.
That's amazing. So what are you working on currently? I know you mentioned policy shapers. Is there anything else you'd like to share of like some wins you've had recently, something exciting you're working on, and anything upcoming that you want to share with folks?
Yeah, sure, sure. So we're doing quite a bit of work with policy shapers around just trying to engage young people to be more active citizens. So in our just most recently concluded election, we had 40 million young people registered to vote. Nigeria's population is about 200 million. We had 40 million young people registered to vote. 26
That's
million of
amazing.
them.
Or I guess
Yeah,
that's a low
I
number.
mean,
I thought you said 20 million young
we,
people.
yeah, no, 40 million. So like we have a lot of people just being interested in the process,
Okay, okay.
especially this past this past elections, and 26 million of them were students, so it shows that people are not just feeling like, oh, politics is for those older generation and it's not
Yeah.
my business. We feel like we're getting more young people involved in that process. So last year we organized something called the Policy Hackathon. So pretty much like a tech hackathon, right? But we made it about policy and ideas and how young people can think of themselves as policymakers. And if you're a policymaker, how would you solve this particular issue? Because the truth is, in a few years, it's the same young people who become leaders of the various institutions and the various organizations, right? So how do you make them to start thinking of themselves as start being solution providers, as opposed to just like complainers, complaining about the
Yeah.
problem, they become part of solving that problem. So we've had quite a bit of that engagement. One of our biggest campaigns is called the Reform IELTS campaign. So you might not know this, but like when like Africa is, when you think about language, Africa is split in two. There's Anglophone Africa and there's Francophone Africa, right? So some bit of Africa speaks French and some bit of Africa speaks English. But generally, Africa is not seen as an English-speaking continent. So despite the fact that we've been communicating over the past 30, 40 minutes in English language, when I try to maybe study in the UK or in the US, or even try to like migrate to the US or migrate to the UK, I'm made to write an English proficiency test that costs almost $300. And the result for the test expires every 2 years. So if I try to migrate to the US and say within the first 2 years, I'm not so successful, there's a long visa queue, etc. By the end of the second year, I would have to rewrite the test because according to the system, my English knowledge has expired. So I didn't have to like prove again that I can speak the same language. I know it's ridiculous. So so as an organization, we've been pushing the campaign. We've been able to mobilize over 80,000 people so far through our petitions and conversations. We've had active campaigns in Kenya, Ghana, Nigeria, Malawi, and now just recently Mauritius. And we're just trying to see how we can get institutions, especially the UK government, right? Because most of the countries in Africa that are English speaking were colonized by the UK.
Right.
And the UK, even though they're like our former colonial masters, they still do not, they set up our systems in English, really. Most of our indigenous languages are dying away. I can barely speak my indigenous languages because I grew up watching cartoons, what's everything in English, school, church, everywhere is English. They still do not feel like we're good enough. So it's a thing where we're trying to advocate for that change. The good news is so far, we've been able to get 21 universities across the world to change their admissions policy. And I mean, kudos to the US. A lot of universities in the US and Canada have been very like receptive to the campaign. They've been willing to make changes. We just had recently Cornell University come on, Northeastern University come on. So like there's so many universities who are joining the campaign and are joining us. And it's been led by young people, people in their 20s, early 20s, mid 20s. And we're hopeful that over the next couple of years, we'll be able to like gather enough momentum to, as more universities come on, we'll be able to put more pressure on the UK government to officially add Nigeria and other Anglophone African countries to the majority English-speaking country list.
And really points to what you were saying, like we can be solution makers, and you are. Like you're empowering those folks and creating change, like real change, which is super exciting.
I think I just like to say thank you for for the good work that you're doing. I think I wouldn't have been able to get on this course if I didn't find a program that discussed biomimicry. And I think that there are many people who you would introduce to this field, to this kind of thinking. I mean, I think this should be the only way to do science, to be honest. Biomimicry should be the only way to design the world. I mean, and if you look at like from previous great inventors like Leonardo da Vinci and all of the folks, like they've always said that nature has been their major source of inspiration, their major driver, So I think that, just the work you're doing is introducing thousands and millions of people to this, people who might not even be born now, I won't be born in years to come, and will just stumble on various episodes, and they'll get to learn about it. So please just keep doing the great work. I think that's what I want to say. Thank you for putting in all the efforts, to making sure that biomimicry stories are out there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for saying that. Yeah, I hope that this is a space where people can get really inspired, a launching point, so to speak, so they can start their own journeys like you have yours with Learn Biomimicry and now all the stuff you're doing. It was an honor and joy to speak to you. And it's been such a pleasure to have this space just to like connect with people all over the world doing this in all very different ways, but all very important ways.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks.
I hope you have a beautiful rest of your day and rest of your week.
I am so motivated by the work of Ebenezar and hope this episode also brings you inspiration too. If you're ready to dive deeper into the world of biomimicry applications and innovation examples, this is a reminder that you can check out asknature.org, Learn Biomimicry, Biomimicry Frontiers, and all the great books where you can explore this practice further. I'll leave you with this quote from Nelson Mandela that I feel is deeply connected to both biomimicry and building our future together. It always seems impossible until it's done.